welcome, and thank you very much for being here. Now, what we have been really talking about, without my mentioning the word, is of course that all this problem about the dialogue between science and society has a lot to do with framing. In fact, it is framing that makes our statements, apocalyptic statements or extreme statements, go on to live their own lives. And it's framing that actually is also helped by the way sometimes we as scientists approach things when journalists want to invite us for comments. And all of you experience with journalists, with media, and so on. And we are, of course, part of that game called framing, because we also need sometimes to present things in such a way that actually we do attract some headlines. But the cost of that is also complex. So let me ask the four of you. Tell us a little bit about your experience in this whole issue of framing, of dialogue versus controversies, of how you deal in your different fields with how things happen. How can you get a message across of nuance instead of apocalyptic views, of polarization, or of other things that you don't want to happen? So Guido, may I ask you first?
Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. And let me, because I see there's two professors from my department in the room, and if I can already see them getting a little bit angry when I'm introduced as a nutritionist. You can see them laughing over there. So coming from the Department of Human Nutrition, oh, three even, yeah, three angry faces. So I am reminded with this introduction of what happened a couple of months ago. There was a new study, and it was presented very flashily by the scientists, very effectively. But the conclusion was not, I think that came out in the media was not very in line with what the study actually said. And when I asked the reporter in question to say, well, could we maybe do a follow-up article and explain the nuances of the stuff, he said, but we already done it, and it's last week's news. Let's not talk about it anymore. And I think that's really an issue. So we have to be flashy on the one hand, but we also have to be able to actually go into the nuance later.
And so what did you do?
I did nothing, is the honest answer, but also...
well, now I can understand why they have angry faces.
No, but it is, the problem is you also have an ongoing relationship. So we know now with these specific journalists that we need to be there earlier and do that more proactively.
Okay, how does it work out for you, Ranja?
Yeah, so for me, I work with techniques called gene editing techniques. And quite often, when I talk to public, or in my case, particular scenario where I spoke to artists, the first thing they screamed out loud, so to me and my colleague, were you're creating, you're going against nature, you're playing God, or they actually screamed out to us in the audience when we were there. But what we actually did is we stayed calm, I must say, along with my colleague, and we explained to them what we wanted to portray. We had a small art collaboration with them so that we could easily tell them what we meant. And because of this art collaboration, it ended up into being a dialogue between us.
You mean art as in artists?
With artists, yes. Yeah. So as part of a cross-pollination that we had for our 100 years celebration. And there we really truly understood the meaning of dialogue, because we were talking to people who were not aware of our terminology. So we understood how to explain gene editing to them, but not just that, but understand that we have to be able to remove their fears. So that is what we try to do now, or at least I will start to do now, is to try and engage with general audience, more practiced way of science communication with general audience.
Where do you think those fears come from?
I mostly think it's from media or from social media these days, because the headlines often are negatively portraying gene editing technologies, in my opinion. So if you're looking at media and that's where your source of information is, then it's easy to get a bit swayed away from the... Of course, you have to have a critical viewpoint, and I don't deny that, but I think it's important to, as scientists, that the facts also get to them and not just myths they're based on.
Thank you. Patrick, now you are extremely active, may I say so, on social media.
Well, just Twitter. Just Twitter.
Just Twitter. Well, that's enough for a start, because at least on Twitter you're very active. So what are your experiences? What do you do? How do you try to do something about this framing issue? Do you manage?
Well, actually, my field, ecology, biodiversity conservation, is a sort of a source of apocalyptic news. Ecologists have been producing warnings about loss of biodiversity, unsustainable land use, extinction crisis, and my colleagues and I...
Sometimes there is some good news.
There is sometimes good news, but often my colleagues and I get a little bit impatient and a little bit dissatisfied with the degree to which society picks up our warnings about how things are going, because we have these goals of the global goals of conserving biodiversity. One of the sustainable development goals is this. So, and then it's then as soon as too much nuance comes in, the message sometimes gets lost. So I find myself a little bit trapped between the role as a scientist, where I have to stress the nuance, and my personal concern that these warnings are just not taken seriously enough. So I do all my twittering as a citizen, trying to separate my role as scientist and citizen. But that doesn't work.
You don't have two accounts?
I do. I have a very boring English account called Janssen Lab, and well, I hardly use it. I usually use the one that I consider personal. But since I'm a scientist, I can't separate citizenship from being a scientist. So I'm struggling with this problem.
We'll come back to that. That is a problem. Tamara, you are not only a scientist, but you're also somebody who studies actually some of these problems. Can you enlighten all of us, and Patrick more in particular, on how we should deal with this problem?
A quick solution. Well, indeed, I study these controversies, and the interesting thing is that social media indeed is a very important source, but time and again we also see that a lot of these concerned citizens actually do want facts or longer established knowledge. So there's a huge group of them that does want to have these facts. So that's one optimistic note here. So there is a message there to tell that's welcome. And also what I've experienced is that studying these controversies, it's really hard not to become part of them. So studying shale gas, for example, they will put you to the spot and say, okay, are you pro or against? So whereas I still try to observe and see what's going on and how these controversies are being played out in media and social media, and with what consequences for policymakers, but also for academics. I also experience that it's hard not to become part of a controversy.
But what can you advise to Patrick? Should he be a split personality for the rest of his life, or can you put him at ease?
Well, I think, in fact, we are always framing. Also, and I know it's a rather controversial thing to say, but in our research, we also make choices. And we do it for particular reasons, because that's the way we produce longer-lasting facts. We have to limit ourselves. We always know that there are limitations to our knowledge. And it's, in fact, those limitations that are sometimes being picked up in the media. So in that sense, we need to be aware of how we frame, and because that may be our weak spot, you could say. So we have to know our weak spots as academics. That's one thing. But also, and I think Guido already said that, and I think you're doing that as well, we engage with society. So we start talking to them, and then listening is very important. So not trying to educate them immediately and say, you got it all wrong, these are the facts, but actually try and understand what the concerns are that people are expressing.
Guido, is it acceptable to exaggerate in order to get your message across, or even to sort of bend the truth a little bit?
Is it acceptable? That I think everybody has to judge that on their personal terms. Is it effective? Yes.
Okay. Here.
Luckily, we have an expert, I think, on morality in the room, so maybe afterwards he can... No, so what you note, so one example from my personal experience was I was invited for a panel show in the evening in the Netherlands to be there on some issue. And then, like, as that always goes with the media, about half an hour before I had to get in my car to be at the studio on time, they said, oh, we bumped you for another guest because we have this really lovely lifestyle influence person. She doesn't know anything about the subject, but she has really funny quotes. And I mean, I think that is something that we as scientists, I mean, this is the first time I'm speaking to an audience with so many professors in them, and maybe the last time, considering what I'm going to say. But I think we need to change with the times that are coming, and I think we need to accept that all full facets of nuance are not going to be able to be conveyed in a soundbite, but the times require sometimes soundbites.
How do you do that? Because it's particularly in genetic modification, Pradhana, it's so difficult to keep the nuance. Do you feel you are forced to exaggerate from time to time? Maybe on the positive side, not on Patrick's side, who is inclined to pessimism. Are you inclined to optimism?
I am inclined to optimism for sure, mostly because there's so much pessimism or skepticism, I would say, around genetic modification. But yeah, personally, as a scientist, I feel, again, I feel like I should bring the right facts in front of the audience, or communicating the right facts to the audience is how I would like to proceed, or that's what I think I can do with.
But if somebody takes your words and says, okay, you've said all this, but in the end, you know I'm right because I'm afraid, and you are a technological technocrat or an optimist, can you still engage in the conversation, or is that the end of the conversation?
It would be a very difficult conversation for sure. Yeah, I wouldn't really know what I would do in that particular scenario that you mentioned now, because at some point, if it is going to become a monologue, and there's a loss of dialogue between if there's not going to be listening, then I wouldn't necessarily know what I would do in that particular scenario, to be honest.
Tamara, what can we do in a situation where there's no room for nuance, where particularly these apocalyptic views abound? Is there anything we can do, or should we try to understand where the fears come from, or can we do that? Are we best placed, or should somebody else do that?
Well, that's a lot of difficult questions in one, but I think there is some hope here, and it starts with little things we can do. So, for example, I know that you were involved in this art project you were just talking about, and it's actually also an exchange about what's in these visualizations that opens up room for dialogue. So there are ways of engaging with very skeptical people by use of, for example, images, or producing new images in which we can explore the differences. I have to say, of course, there are people out there who really don't care, and who really just want to spread what Franklin calls bullshit. So I don't think we can engage with those. I mean, maybe we can see and learn what they're trying to convey, but there is a minority, a very small group that we maybe cannot engage in a dialogue with, because a dialogue is a two-way conversation. But there are many other ways in which we can still, even with very skeptical people, create a room to understand each other. And also address emotional concerns. So, for example, research also demonstrates that even though people have all the facts, then still maybe it's an emotional concern or a fear that we need to talk to. And then maybe it's no longer up to us academics to do that, but there is still something that can be done.
One of the interesting things to me is, in the last 5 years, I would have predicted 5 years ago that the trust in scientific data would decrease. But in fact, that's not the case. What happens is that science or scientific results are used selectively. So it is as if science has become a kind of supermarket where you can actually shop for your own arguments and your own data and use them as tools to put, bang on the head of others. So the trust also, if you look at different studies, not just in the Netherlands, but in OECD countries in general, people trust science, but they only trust their part of it. And that is a big problem. So, Patrick, when I turn to you, of course, you have a large following of people who are very much in line with you. So in a way, you don't have the problem that maybe Guido has, who has to try and defend a study on milk to people who do not believe milk is doing any good. But what about you? You still have people who are very selective in what they want to hear from you or what they want to see. Can you give them the whole picture, or have you given up?
No, I haven't given up. Well, it's not. I'm not just followed by naturalists. I'm also followed by lots of journalists, politicians, policymakers, and then lots of farmers, especially farmers from the intense corner, and also organic farmers. So pretty diverse group. So whenever I post something and get lots of different kinds of feedback, and I find it interesting because I'm sort of searching for answers, searching for the big picture, and trying to make sense of all the things that happen and see where my field can make a difference, can make a contribution to solutions. But this whole dialogue by itself, for me, is a search effort. I try to find ways. I put in what I know, I put in what I see, I put in what I think about stuff, I put in the things I read, and then what I get back are, well, confirmations, but also resistance, and then sort of sharpens my mind. I see it as a sort of source for understanding better.
So is it possible to change your mind?
Yeah.
That's a rather hesitant.
Well, about what I was thinking about what I'm still a little bit pessimistic, so I'm not so optimistic as you are. But yeah, about how our agricultural system functions, for example, I changed my mind a lot of times, maybe too often. No, I'm open, but still nobody convinced me that biodiversity is doing great.
No, I wasn't suggesting that at all.
Social research also demonstrates that it's possible for groups of people also to change their mind. So there is indeed also a task here, or a role to play for the social sciences, who can do this on an aggregated level, I think, and give us more insights. And there is already that type of research that we can also use when thinking about us as academics and how to further develop.
Well, that's an excellent plea, and I'm looking at the Director of Social Sciences, who I don't see, but I know he's here. So this is a task. I've always said you social sciences have an important role to play. Here is an opening. So let's take that one up.
Yeah.
But, of course, the problem, Guido, is that it's not just about words and facts. It's also about images. And they often say, of course, one image is more than 1,000 words. What worries me more, actually, is that YouTube has become the most used search machine, which means that people search for images rather than for words and text. And I believe there may be entire generations of students, and I'm looking at you at the back, who don't even want to search for text anymore. But images, as we know, can be false, can be fraud, can be partial, can be confusing, can be a lot of things. And particularly in the area of nutrition, just to take that, the way you portray a person or the way you portray a diet makes all the difference. If you put an obese person in front of a cookie, I mean, you just have the framing there. So is there a way in which you've tried to use images in a positive manner, or is that excluded?
No, I think that's exactly what we need to do. I think we need to go with the times, and at the Department of Human Nutrition right now, we're creating our own animation to explain what we do to the world. We need to adapt to this as a mode of communication and see how our content fits that, instead of trying to change the world and the way in which people want to have their information. One larger risk I feel in the use of YouTube, for example, is that the algorithm in YouTube senses what you found interesting and then gives you suggestions on what you potentially will find interesting, and it creates these rabbit holes where people go into and they just never come out, and they believe that all of the information in there in YouTube is geared into this one pathway. And I think that's exactly where we as a university, I mean, just imagine the fact that we have people here researching agriculture, researching how to, the husbandry of animals, but we also have people researching agriculture, researching meat replacements, and it's all in this one institution. So I think broadening the ideas that are out there and broadening people's minds, because social media is not going to do that. It's actually going to narrow people's minds. I think that's really, in essence, what we should be doing right now.
Berthan, how can we actually broaden people's minds on genetic modification, gene editing, and so on? Because it's still seen very much in the framework of playing God or, you know, intervening in nature, which we shouldn't be doing. There are more and more rules and regulations that actually make your work and our work collectively more and more difficult. Do you see a way out there? Can we do something?
I think one of the first things that we need to address is addressing what a GMO is, right? So I think normally GMO has now become a jargon that's the trash jargon. So sometimes you also have additions, sometimes there's subtractions, sometimes you have positive effects, sometimes you have negative effects. So I think we first need to use the term GMO in a way, or explain or label GMO for what actually happened there, what happened to that crop or to the cell and whatever. But as long as we have labels that clearly mention what they are and what has happened, I think that could help to.
Isn't that exactly, Berthan, the kind of scientist's answer that we would all like to give? By going by the right definitions and so on, whereas what is out there is perhaps a set of emotions of people who don't want to know even about definitions, but just, you know, have all the red flags up.
Yes.
Can you communicate with people who don't want to know about definitions and clarity of words?
That's that's probably where images and videos or multimedia comes into play, especially in terms of gene editing. I do agree that there are a lot of crap also on YouTube, but there are also some really nice videos that explain the fundamentals of how this technology was from a bacterium as a defense system has become a gene editing tool. I mean, in a few minutes, in 5 or 6 minutes, you basically understand the system and the pros and the cons, advantages, disadvantages of using the system. Yeah. So I think images in that sense or multimedia in that format would really help in communication, where you don't have to use specific terms, but you know, you have animations there which explain what is happening. So I think there definitely is a plus to use images and videos, and more scientists should use that the platform.
Right, so images in some ways. Now, what is the best possible advice you can give to your colleagues? Because all of you have been exposed in some ways to these different types of problems. Is there any piece of advice you could give to the others in the room who may have different experiences? What's the best possible thing they can do?
Don't start twittering. It's addictive. It takes a lot of time. You get a lot of crap, really. But it's also very nice. No, you learn a lot. But I don't think Twitter is the best
so what
possible channel.
What is your alternative then? What is the alternative?
Yeah, well, maybe videos, but you don't produce any videos like that. You can form yourself an opinion about something, or pay some attention to a certain paper that was just published, and say something about it, say what it means, in just a few tweets. It's quick. Yeah. Producing a video is well, it's.
But I don't think, it's not the video itself that is the end-all be-all, but a video forces you to be concise and to be definitive. And I think as a scientist, we are, from the moment you start with your MSc thesis all the way up to the end of your career, you are constantly being hammered down on nuance, being showing your limitations, being very hesitant and being definitive. But that's not what's going to work in the media. So I think, especially if you are at the end of your career and there's really only a handful of people in the world who know more than you, I think you should take the liberty to be very definitive in what you say in media.
Okay, that's a good lesson. Berthan, any lessons for your colleagues, also those who are not microbiologists or not in genetics?
What I've learned is talking, communication. Not just to fellow colleagues, but also to students, to general public. I would say dialogue is actually my advice. Yeah.
Now, Tamara, you already offered a lot of help from all the social scientists to get this thing cleared out in terms of target groups and so on. But from your own experience, what would you give to the audience? What is really the kind of thing not to do or to do?
I think you should start twittering. I think
I warned.
Yeah. No, so I
Are you following one another?
yes,
Yes,
we are.
since last,
since
last week.
Since last week.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, no, because I think it's one way to sort of offer an alternative framing. So, and also think of it in terms of framing and use visuals that you think that are still conveying a message that has some sound facts to it, but is also including the more emotional message that you are conveying. So in that sense, I would say we can use that and start twittering, because it's actually on Twitter that the most severe, the trolls and the really the critics are out there. So it's one of the platforms that needs counter discourses or counter framing.
Yeah, I must say I'm on Twitter myself. My experiences are not too bad. Every 2 months there's somebody who says Mrs. Fresco is very dumb, but I can live with that. And apart from that, actually it is a way to exchange things, and not just scientific facts, but also sometimes indeed images. So ladies and gentlemen, the verdict is out on this, but I think what I hope you will remember is that everywhere in the organization we're trying to get this idea of dialogue as an academic responsibility, as an ongoing thing in our program, in the way we operate. So please join me in thanking our panel, and we'll move on to the last 2 important parts of this program. Thank you very much, panel.
You're welcome.